The Wyoming sun beat down without mercy that August morning in 1885. Daniel Fletcher stood in the doorway of his barn, squinting against the white glare that turned the prairie into a shimmering mirage of gold and dust. Sweat carved clean lines through the dirt on his face. His shoulders carried the familiar ache of solitude, the kind that settles into a man's bones when he's been alone long enough to forget what company feels like. 3 years. That's how long it had been since Grace closed her eyes in that frozen January night. 3 years since the fever took her, while Daniel watched helpless as he'd been on a dozen battlefields where good men died screaming. 3 years since he'd spoken more than necessary words to another living soul. The ranch still ran, the cattle still grazed, but everything moved in silence now. A ghost operation run by a ghost of a man. Daniel preferred it that way. Silence didn't ask questions. Silence didn't leave. He was turning back toward the fence line, Winchester in hand, when he heard it. A small sound, barely audible over the wind, rattling through the cottonwoods. A scrape, maybe. Or a footfall, coming from the direction of the house. Daniel went still. His place sat 5 miles outside Redemption, far enough that visitors were rare and usually announced by the sound of hoofbeats long before they arrived. He listened harder, filtering out the wind, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of the windmill. There it was again. Definitely coming from near the house. From the root cellar, if he wasn't mistaken. His jaw tightened. It wouldn't be the first time some drifter had helped themselves to his stores. Last spring, he'd run off a pair of cowboys who decided his smokehouse was fair game. The spring before that, a family of settlers had camped in his barn without asking, leaving their trash and taking half a bag of oats when they moved on. Daniel crossed the yard with long strides, boots kicking up little clouds of dust with each step. The root cellar doors sat at an angle against the side of the house, weathered wood-bleached gray by sun and time. One of them stood slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible in the crack. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his Winchester from where it leaned against the porch rail, checked the chamber with practiced efficiency, and pulled open the cellar door in one smooth motion. Sunlight flooded down the wooden steps, illuminating dust motes that danced like stars in the sudden brightness. "Come on out," he said. His voice was level and hard, the voice he'd used to give orders to frighten boys wearing Union blue. "Got a rifle aimed right where you're standing." For a long moment, nothing. Then a rustle, and a figure emerged from the shadows at the bottom of the stairs. Small, too small to be a man. Daniel's eyes adjusted, and he found himself looking at a girl. Maybe 15, maybe 16. Hard to tell through the layer of grime that covered her like a second skin. She wore a dress so faded its original color was anyone's guess, torn at the hem and stained with what looked like dried blood. Her feet were bare and filthy, wrapped in strips of cloth that had once been white. Dark hair fell loose around her shoulders in tangles that spoke of days without care. She held an apple in one hand, half-eaten. Her eyes were the color of creek water, in winter gray and clear and empty of everything except exhaustion. The Winchester was heavy in Daniel's hands. His finger rested on the trigger steady. He'd killed men before. Boys, really. Confederate soldiers who'd been somebody's sons, somebody's brothers, maybe somebody's fathers. He'd looked into their eyes as they died and felt nothing because feeling would have destroyed him. But this girl looked up at him without pleading, without tears. Just a flat, exhausted emptiness that made something twist uncomfortably in Daniel's chest. He recognized that look. He'd seen it in his own mirror for 3 years. "My parents died this morning," she said. Her voice was quiet but clear, each word falling into the silence like a stone into still water. "I only wanted an apple." Daniel's finger stayed on the trigger. The girl didn't move, didn't flinch. She just stood there at the bottom of his cellar stairs, barefoot and hollow, like she'd already accepted whatever came next. Something in Daniel's hand began to shake. Not fear. He'd faced Confederate artillery at Gettysburg without trembling. He'd charged through the wilderness with bullets whining past his ears like angry hornets. He'd held dying men in his arms and felt their last breath rattle out against his chest. But this girl, this child covered in grave dirt with death in her eyes, made his hand shake. He lowered the rifle. The movement surprised him as much as it probably surprised her. Daniel Fletcher didn't make decisions on impulse anymore. He planned, he calculated, he survived. But looking at this girl, he saw something he thought he buried with Grace. He saw purpose. "Your parents," he repeated slowly, his voice rougher than he intended. Cholera, she said. She took another bite of the apple, chewing mechanically like eating was just another task to complete before the end. We were camped by the creek 2 miles east. They got sick 3 days ago. This morning they stopped breathing. I buried them as best I could and started walking. Saw your place from the ridge. Daniel studied her face. No tears, no trembling. Just that terrible flatness, like something inside her had already died and was just waiting for her body to catch up. He'd worn that expression himself in the months after Grace. He wore it still most days. You eat that whole apple, he asked. Yes, sir. Take anything else? No, sir, just the one apple. I was going to leave before you noticed. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and dry grass. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out lonely and wild. Daniel looked at this girl child standing in his cellar, covered in grave dirt and road dust, and felt the weight of a choice settling onto his shoulders. He could send her on her way. Probably should. The town had a church charitable women who took in strays. It wasn't his responsibility. He'd chosen solitude, deliberately built it like a fence around his life after Grace died. Let someone else deal with orphans and their troubles. But the words that came out of his mouth surprised him. You hungry for more than an apple. The girl's eyes widened slightly, the first real expression he'd seen on her face. Sir. Got beans on the stove, Daniel said. Dishoyam. Cornbread from yesterday. You look like you could use a proper meal before you head wherever you're heading. She stared at him for a long moment as if checking for a trap. Then slowly she nodded. Yes, sir. Thank you. Daniel stepped back from the cellar entrance. Come on up then. But you try to steal anything else and charity ends quick. We clear. Yes, sir. She climbed the stairs slowly, and in the full sunlight, Daniel could see just how thin she was. The dress hung on a frame that was mostly bone and stubborn will. Her feet were worse than he'd thought, torn up and bleeding in places through the makeshift bandages. When she reached the top step, she swayed slightly, and Daniel realized with a start that she was probably close to collapse. When's the last time you drank water? He asked. Yesterday evening, I think, at the creek. Daniel bit back a curse. 3 years of living alone had made him forget how to care for anyone but himself and his animals. But the instinct was still there, buried under the grief and the silence. The same instinct that had made him share his rations with wounded Confederates after battles, even when they were supposed to be enemies. Inside, he said, now. The house was dark and cool after the brutal sun. Daniel pointed her toward the table, a heavy oak thing that Grace had insisted they bring from Ohio, one of the few pieces of their old life that had survived the journey west. The girl sat carefully, like she was afraid the chair might collapse under her, and folded her hands in her lap. Daniel pumped water into a tin cup and set it in front of her. She picked it up with both hands and drank it down without stopping, water spilling from the corners of her mouth. He refilled it twice more before she finally set the cup down and drew a shaking breath. Slowly now, he said, surprised by the gentleness in his own voice. You make yourself sick, it defeats the purpose. Yes, sir. He ladled beans into a bowl, cut a thick slice of cornbread, and put both in front of her. She looked at the food like it might vanish if she blinked. Then she picked up the spoon and started eating with careful, deliberate bites, the kind that said she'd gone hungry before and knew better than to rush. Daniel sat down across from her, his own plate forgotten. He should eat. He'd been working since dawn and his body needed fuel. But something about watching this girl consume beans and cornbread with the focused intensity of someone who didn't know when the next meal might come made his own hunger seem trivial. He'd seen that kind of hunger in the war. In the faces of civilians caught between armies, their homes burned, their crops destroyed. He'd seen it in his own men during the winter campaigns when supply lines broke down and they marched on empty stomachs through snow that came up to their knees. But he'd never expected to see it here in Wyoming in peacetime, in a girl who should have been worrying about dresses and dances instead of survival. Got a name? He asked. She swallowed before answering, her manners somehow intact despite everything. Emma. Emma Hayes. Daniel Fletcher. I know, she said. I heard people in town mention your name when we passed through last week. That surprised him. What did they say? Emma's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. That you kept to yourself, that your wife died and you didn't want company anymore. Accurate enough. They tell you anything else? That you were fair but hard. that you didn't suffer fools or trespassers. She met his eyes then, and for the first time he saw a flicker of something other than exhaustion, maybe defiance, maybe just honesty. I'm sorry I trespassed. I thought you wouldn't notice one apple. I thought I'd be gone before dawn. Where were you planning to go? The flicker died. I don't know, just away. Daniel leaned back in his chair, studying her. 15, maybe 16, orphaned, no family that she'd mentioned, barefoot and half-starved. The smart thing would be to feed her, give her some supplies, and send her into town. Redemption had a church, a pastor's wife who took pride in her charity work. They'd find a place for her. But even as he thought it, Daniel knew what would happen. A girl with no family, no prospects, no protection. She'd be passed around like an unwanted burden, working for her keep until she was old enough to marry whatever man was desperate or cruel enough to take a penniless orphan as a wife. He'd seen it before. The West was full of girls like that, ground down by circumstance until they disappeared entirely, their names forgotten, their stories untold. You got any kin? He asked. Anywhere. Emma shook her head. It was just the three of us. My father had a brother in Missouri, but they haven't spoken in 10 years. I don't even know if he's alive. What about your mother's people? Dead. Fever took them during the war. Daniel rubbed his jaw, feeling stubble rasp under his palm. The smart thing, the safe thing, the thing that would let him return to his carefully constructed solitude. But then he thought about Grace, about how she would have reacted if she'd found this girl in their cellar. Grace would have brought Emma inside without hesitation, would have fed her and clothed her, and probably invited her to stay as long as she needed. Grace had believed in helping people and doing what was right, even when it was hard. Daniel had lost that part of himself when she died. Or maybe he'd lost it even earlier in the war, when he'd learned that good intentions got men killed, and survival meant closing your heart to anything that might make you weak. But looking at Emma Hayes, he felt something crack open inside his chest, something that had been frozen for 3 years. You know anything about ranch work? He heard himself ask. Emma's eyes widened again. Sir, chickens, garden, cooking, mending. You know how to do any of that? Yes, sir. My mother taught me. We had a small place in Nebraska before things went bad. Daniel nodded slowly, already regretting the words forming in his mind, but unable to stop them. I could use someone around here, just temporarily, he added quickly, as much for his own benefit as hers. Until you figure out what you want to do. There's a room off the kitchen storage mostly, but it's got a window and a cot. You work for your keep, stay out of trouble, and when you're ready to move on, I'll stake you some supplies and point you in whatever direction you choose. The girl stared at him like he'd just spoken in tongues. You're offering me work, she said, slowly testing the words. A place to stay. Temporarily. Daniel repeated, his voice harder this time, trying to rebuild the walls that had somehow crumbled in the last 5 minutes. I'm not looking for permanent company, but you're young and you've got no one, and turning you out right now would be the same as signing your death warrant. I won't have that on my conscience. Emma set down her spoon with shaking hands. For the first time since he'd found her in the cellar, her eyes filled with water. Not tears, not quite, but something close. Why? The question was so quiet he almost missed it. Why would you help me? You don't know me. I trespassed on your property. You could have shot me and been within your rights. Daniel looked away toward the window where dust motes danced in the afternoon light. Alone, he thought, because I know what it's like to lose everything. Because Grace would have taken you in without a second thought, and maybe doing this is the last decent thing I have left in me. But he didn't say any of that. Instead, he stood up and carried his plate to the sink. Finish your food, he said. Then I'll show you the room. We start work at dawn. The first week passed in a blur of silent mornings and exhausted evenings. Emma moved through the ranch like a ghost, doing what was asked, and then finding more to do without being told. She fed the chickens at dawn, weeded the garden until her hands blistered, scrubbed floors that hadn't seen soap in months. Daniel watched her work with the careful attention he'd learned in the army, where knowing your soldiers could mean the difference between victory and massacre. She was stronger than she looked, this girl. Tougher. She didn't complain when the work was hard or the day was long. She just did what needed doing and then moved on to the next task. On the third morning, Daniel found a pair of boots outside her door. Grace's boots worn but serviceable, the leather still good. He'd left them there sometime after midnight, unable to sleep, unable to stop thinking about Emma's torn feet wrapped in bloody rags. He didn't mention it. She didn't thank him. But the next evening he found his shirts mended, buttons replaced, tears sewn shut with careful stitches. Small exchanges, unspoken agreements. The beginning of something Daniel wasn't ready to name. On the seventh day, as they sat across from each other eating supper in comfortable silence, Daniel made a decision. $1 a week, he said, not looking at her. Plus room and board. Emma's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Sir, wages, Daniel said more firmly this time. You work, you get paid. That's how it works. But I'm working for room and board. That's what we agreed. I'm changing the agreement. He finally met her eyes. $1 a week. You've earned it. Emma stared at the plate in front of her, and Daniel saw her throat work as she swallowed hard. Thank you, she whispered. He grunted and went back to his meal, uncomfortable with the gratitude in her voice, with the emotion that threatened to crack through his carefully maintained distance. This was business, just business. A fair exchange of labor for compensation. Nothing more. But that night, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, Daniel admitted the truth to himself. Emma Hayes reminded him what it felt like to have something worth protecting. For 3 years, he'd just been going through the motions, working because that's what you did, surviving, because dying seemed like too much effort. Then this girl had appeared in his root cellar, and suddenly he had a reason to get up in the morning that wasn't just habit. Watching her bring the ranch back to life, the garden, the house, even the chickens seemed to lay better under her care, reminded him that things could grow again. Even in hard soil, even after everything burned down. The second week brought new challenges. Daniel needed supplies from town, things he couldn't make or grow himself. Flour, sugar, coffee, nails for the fence repairs. He'd been putting it off, preferring the isolation of the ranch to the scrutiny of Redemption's Main Street. But supplies were supplies, and a man couldn't run a ranch on pride alone. He saddled his horse and looked at Emma, who was scattering corn for the chickens. You want to come into Redemption? He asked, trying to keep his voice casual. She went very still, her hand frozen in the feed bucket. No, sir, I'll stay here. You can't hide forever. I'm not hiding, but the fear in her eyes said otherwise. I'd rather not. Daniel studied her face, seeing the terror she was trying to bury under stubborn pride. He understood that fear. He'd felt it himself in the months after Grace died, when leaving the ranch meant facing sympathetic looks and awkward condolences from people who meant well, but couldn't possibly understand. All right, he said. I'll be back before dark. You need anything? No, sir. Thank you. He rode out, and Emma watched until he disappeared over the ridge. Then she went back to work, moving faster now, as if she could outrun the fear by staying busy. Redemption looked the same as always when Daniel rode in. Dusty street, weathered buildings, the white church steeple pointing toward heaven like an accusation. He tied his horse outside Porter's general store and pushed through the door, the bell above jangling to announce his arrival. Mrs. Porter looked up from her counter, her expression shifting from neutral to something harder when she saw him. Mr. Fletcher, she said. Her voice was carefully neutral, but her eyes were cold. What can I get for you? Daniel pulled out his list, reading off items in a flat voice while Mrs. Porter gathered them with mechanical efficiency. No small talk, no pleasantries, just business conducted in the kind of silence that felt like judgment. He was paying his purchases when the door opened again and Sheriff Tom Bradley walked in. Tom stopped when he saw Daniel's surprise flickering across his weathered face. Dan, Tom said. Been a while? Tom. They looked at each other across the store, and Daniel felt the weight of shared history pressing down on him. Tom Bradley had saved his life at Gettysburg, had pulled him behind a stone wall while Confederate bullets chewed up the ground where Daniel had been standing. They'd fought side by side through 3 years of hell, had shared rations and whiskey and the terrible intimacy of men who'd seen each other at their worst. After the war, Tom had followed Daniel west, had stood up with him at his wedding to Grace, had been there the night she died. But in the 3 years since they drifted apart, Daniel's grief had built walls that friendship couldn't scale. How's the ranch? Tom asked, moving closer but keeping a careful distance like approaching a wounded animal. Fine. Heard you got some help out there. A girl. And there it was, the real reason Tom had stopped the question, hiding behind friendly concern. Emma Hayes, Daniel said, his voice hardening. She's working for wages, Room and board plus $1 a week. Tom nodded slowly, his eyes searching Daniel's face. People are talking, Dan. Mrs. Blackwood especially. She's got concerns. Mrs. Blackwood can keep her concerns to herself. I know how you feel, but she's got influence in this town. And a young girl living with a bachelor rancher, well, it raises questions. Daniel felt anger rise. Anger he'd felt on battlefields when officers sent men to die for worthless ground. The same anger he'd felt watching Grace slip away while he stood helpless. Emma works for me, he said, each word falling like a hammer blow. That's all anyone needs to know. Tom raised his hands in a placating gesture. I'm not saying I agree with the gossip, just warning you it exists. You're my friend, Dan. I don't want to see you hurt by wagging tongues. Then tell the tongues to stop wagging. It's not that simple. Isn't it? Daniel picked up his supplies, hefting the sacks onto his shoulder. You're the sheriff, Tom. Part of your job is keeping the peace. Last I checked, that included stopping folks from spreading lies about innocent people. There's no law against talking. No, just against having a conscience, apparently. The words came out harsher than Daniel intended, and he saw Tom flinch. But he didn't take them back. He just nodded once and walked out, leaving Tom standing in the store looking like a man who'd been slapped. Outside, Daniel loaded his supplies onto his horse, his hands shaking slightly with suppressed rage. He'd killed men in the war. Good men. Men who were just following orders, just trying to survive, just wanting to go home to their families. He'd done terrible things in the name of duty and watched friends die for causes that seemed noble at the time, but turned hollow in the light of peace. And now these small-town hypocrites wanted to judge him for giving a homeless girl a place to work. He was climbing into the saddle when he heard a voice behind him. Mr. Fletcher. Daniel turned to see Mrs. Abigail Blackwood standing on the boardwalk, her thin frame draped in black despite the heat. She looked like a crow, he thought, sharp and predatory at all angles and hard edges. Mrs. Blackwood, she approached with careful steps, her hands folded primly in front of her. I wonder if I might have a word. I'm in a hurry. This won't take long. Her voice was sweet as poisoned honey. I've heard you've taken in a young woman. An orphan, I understand. Emma Hayes works for me. If that's your concern, you can rest easy. Oh, I'm not concerned about the nature of your employment arrangement, Mr. Fletcher. I'm concerned about the girl herself, a young woman without proper guidance, without Christian supervision, living alone with a man. It creates certain impressions. Daniel felt his jaw tighten. What kind of impressions? The unfortunate kind, the kind that damage reputations, both hers and yours. Mrs. Blackwood's smile didn't reach her eyes. I've come to offer a solution. I would be happy to take Miss Hayes into my household. I could provide her with proper Christian education, teach her the domestic skills she'll need, and ensure she's raised in an environment suitable for a young woman. Emma's fine where she is. Is she, though, Mr. Fletcher? I don't doubt your good intentions. But a ranch is no place for a girl her age, especially without a woman's presence to guide her. And the talk, well, it will only get worse for both of you. Daniel looked at Mrs. Blackwood at the false concern in her eyes and saw something he recognized from the war. The same look officers had worn when they talked about glory and honor while sending boys to die. The same look politicians had worn when they talked about preserving the Union while farms burned and families starved. It was the look of someone who cared more about control than compassion. Thank you for your offer, Mrs. Blackwood, he said, his voice flat and hard. But Emma stays where she is. Good day. He rode out before she could respond, leaving her standing on the boardwalk with her mouth open in surprise. No one said no to Mrs. Blackwood, not in redemption. She ran the church auxiliary, organized all the charitable events, and had the ear of every merchant and rancher in the county. Daniel didn't care. He'd faced Confederate artillery without flinching. He wasn't about to be intimidated by a self-righteous busybody with a Bible in one hand and a grudge in the other. The ride back to the ranch gave him time to think. About Emma. About the choice he'd made to help her. About the consequences that were already starting to ripple out from that choice. He could still send her away. Tell her Mrs. Blackwood had made a generous offer, and it would be best for everyone if she accepted. Emma would understand. She'd pack her few belongings and go without complaint, grateful for the 2 weeks of safety he'd provided. It would be the smart thing to do. the safe thing, the thing that would let him return to his comfortable solitude without the complication of town gossip and moral judgment. But riding across the prairie with the sun beating down and the wind carrying the scent of sage, Daniel realized something. He didn't want the smart thing. He didn't want safe. He'd been safe for 3 years, and it had nearly killed him. Emma Hayes had walked into his life like a ghost, and somehow, impossibly, she'd reminded him what it felt like to be alive, to have purpose, to protect something worth protecting. He wasn't giving that up, not for Mrs. Blackwood, not for anyone. When he rode into the yard, Emma was in the garden, hands dark with soil, her face flushed from the heat. She looked up as he approached, and something in her expression made him think she'd been worrying the whole time he was gone. "Everything all right?" she asked. "Fine," Daniel said, dismounting. He pulled a package from his saddlebag. "Got you something." Emma wiped her hands on her dress and took the package, carefully unwrapping the brown paper to reveal a length of blue fabric, simple but good quality. "For a dress," Daniel said, suddenly awkward. "If you know how to sew." "I do." Emma's voice was soft. "Thank you. How much do I owe you?" "Nothing. Consider it part of your wages." She looked up at him, and Daniel saw tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "You've already done so much." "It's just fabric, Emma." "No." She shook her head. "It's not." They stood there in the yard for a moment, the package between them, and Daniel felt something shift in the air. Not romance, he told himself. Nothing like that. Just recognition. Two people who'd lost everything finding in each other something like understanding. "Town's talking," he said, finally feeling she deserved to know. Mrs. Blackwood especially. "She offered to take you in." Emma's face went pale. "What did you say?" "I said no. But the talk, it'll make things hard for you." "Let it." Daniel pulled the saddle from his horse, his movements deliberate. "I've faced worse than gossip, and I keep my word. You're staying here as long as you want to, and anyone who's got a problem with them that can take it up with me directly." Emma was quiet for a long moment. Then so softly he almost missed it, she said, "No one's ever stood up for me before. Not like that." Daniel didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. He just carried his saddle to the barn, leaving Emma standing in the garden with her blue fabric and her tears, and tried to ignore the warmth spreading through his chest. That night, as they sat on the porch watching stars emerge, Daniel found himself talking more than he had in years. About the ranch, about the plans he'd had before Grace died, about the drought that had nearly broken him 2 summers back, and the winter storm that had killed 20 head of cattle. Emma listened without interrupting, asking occasional questions that showed she was really paying attention, really trying to understand. It reminded Daniel of Grace, who'd had the same gift for listening, for making you feel like your words mattered. But Emma wasn't Grace. She was her own person, with her own strength and her own quiet determination. And maybe that was better. Maybe that's what Daniel needed. Not a replacement for what he'd lost, but something new, something unexpected, something worth fighting for. 2 weeks became 3. The garden showed green shoots pushing through soil. The chickens laid more regularly under Emma's care. The house lost some of its dusty neglect rooms that had been closed for years, now open to light and air. And slowly, carefully, Daniel began to feel like a man again, instead of a ghost. It was the 4th week when trouble found them. Daniel was checking fence line on the north pasture when he saw the riders coming. 3 men on horseback moving at an easy pace across his land, without permission, without invitation. He recognized 2 of them as hands from the Morrison Ranch 5 miles west. The third was younger, maybe 18, with the cocky slouch of someone who thought the world owed him something. Daniel's hand moved to the pistol at his hip as he rode to intercept them. On his land, without asking. That was trespassing, and in Wyoming territory, that could get a man shot. "Fletcher," the oldest one called out, reining in his horse. His name was Wade Morrison, Daniel remembered. Owner of the biggest spread in the county, and a man who thought money gave him the right to do whatever he pleased. "Morrison, you're on my land. Just passing through, wanted to have a word." "You want to have a word, you come to my door like civilized people. You don't ride across my property like you own it." Wade's smile didn't reach his eyes. "No offense intended, Fletcher. Just heard some interesting talk in town. Figured I'd come see for myself if the rumors were true." "What rumors would those be?" "That you got yourself a young girl living up at your place. Pretty thing, folks say. Raising some eyebrows, if you know what I mean." Daniel felt rage building in his chest, hot and sudden. But he kept his voice level and his hand steady on his gun. What I do on my own property is my business. Not yours, not anyone's. The younger rider spoke up, grinning. Just seems odd is all. Lonely widower taking in a pretty young girl. Makes a man wonder what kind of arrangement you got there. The implication hung in the air like gun smoke. Daniel's vision narrowed, focusing on the young man's smirking face. He'd killed men for less during the war. Stupid boys who didn't know when to keep their mouths shut. You got something to say, Daniel said, his voice dropping to the tone he'd used before, ordering men to fix bayonets. Say it plain. Wade held up a hand, playing peacemaker. Easy now, Fletcher. We're just delivering a message. Mrs. Blackwood asked us to check on you, make sure everything's on the up and up, and to remind you that the offer still stands. She'd be happy to take the girl and give her proper supervision. Tell Mrs. Blackwood to mind her own damn business. That's not very neighborly. Neither is trespassing. Daniel's hand tightened on his pistol, and the three riders saw it. Wade's smile faded. The younger one stopped grinning. Even the third rider, who'd been silent until now, shifted in his saddle. You threatening us, Fletcher? Wade asked, his voice harder now. I'm telling you to get off my land. You got to the count of 3. For a moment, the air felt tight with possibility. 3 against 1 wasn't great odds, but Daniel had faced worse. And he was on his own land, which gave him the legal right to defend it. The riders knew that. They also knew Daniel Fletcher had survived Gettysburg and the wilderness. A man didn't walk away from those battles without knowing how to kill. 1, Daniel said. Wade gathered his reins, turning his horse. Your funeral, Fletcher. Just don't say we didn't warn you. 2. They rode off before he reached 3, moving fast now, their casual arrogance replaced by something closer to fear. Daniel watched them go, his hand still on his gun, his heart pounding with adrenaline and rage. He'd made an enemy today. Wade Morrison wasn't the type to forget a perceived insult, but Daniel didn't care. He'd faced real enemies in the war, men who wanted him dead for the crime of wearing blue instead of gray. Wade Morrison was just a bully with money, and Daniel had dealt with plenty of those. When he got back to the house, Emma was hanging laundry sheets, snapping in the wind. She took one look at his face and went still. What happened? He told her. All of it, and as he spoke, he watched her face close down, that terrible flatness returning to her eyes. I should leave, she said when he finished. No. Mr. Fletcher, if my being here causes you trouble with your neighbors, with the town, I can't. I won't be responsible for that. Emma, Daniel stepped closer, looking her directly in the eyes. I don't care about trouble. I've lived through a war. I watched good men die for causes that turned out to be lies. I buried my wife when I was helpless to save her. Trouble doesn't scare me anymore. But your reputation, your business? My reputation is my own to manage. And as for business, I built this ranch once from nothing. If I have to do it again, so be it. But you're staying here as long as you need to, and I don't care what Morrison or Mrs. Blackwood or the whole damn town thinks about it. Emma looked down at her hands twisted together at her waist. I don't understand. Why would you risk all this for someone you barely know? Because you remind me that there are still things worth fighting for, Daniel thought. Because watching you bring this place back to life has reminded me what it feels like to hope. Because in 4 weeks, you've become more real to me than anyone it has been in 3 years. But he didn't say any of that. Instead, he picked up the laundry basket and carried it toward the house. Because it's the right thing to do, he said, and I'm too old and too stubborn to let other people tell me what's right anymore. Behind him, Emma stood in the yard with clean sheets billowing around her, and for the first time since her parents died, she felt something unfamiliar bloom in her chest. Hope. That hope was tested 3 days later when the storm came. Daniel woke before dawn to the sound of wind screaming around the corners of the house, rattling shutters, and tearing at anything not nailed down. He dressed quickly and went to the window, peering out into darkness, broken only by occasional flashes of lightning that turned the world stark white for half a second before plunging it back into black. The chickens, the horses, the cattle in the north pasture, including 3 cows ready to calve. If this storm spooked them, they'd scatter and he'd lose half the herd. He grabbed his coat and hat, both already soaked from yesterday's rain, and headed for the door. Emma was already in the kitchen, fully dressed, her hair braided tight against Heard it coming, she said. What do you need me to do? Get the chickens into the hen house and bar the door. Check the root cellar, make sure it's sealed tight. Then get back inside and stay there. What about you? I've got to get the horses into the barn and check on the cattle. Some of them are about to calve. If this storm spooks them, they'll run and we'll lose everything. Lightning cracked close enough to make the window shake. Emma grabbed her shawl, wrapping it tight. I'm coming with you, she said. Like hell you are. That wind will knock you flat. Then we'll both get knocked flat together. Her jaw was set in that stubborn line he'd come to recognize. You can't do all of this alone, and you know it. Stop wasting time arguing and tell me what to do. Daniel wanted to refuse, wanted to keep her safe inside where the storm couldn't touch her. But she was right. The ranch was too big, the storm too fierce for one person to manage alone. And standing there looking at her determined face, he made a decision he'd probably regret. Fine, you take the chickens and secure the barn. I'll get the horses. Then we both go for the cattle. But you do exactly what I say when I say it. Understood. Understood. They pushed out into the maelstrom together. The wind hit like a physical thing, stealing breath and nearly knocking Emma sideways. Daniel grabbed her arm, steadying her, and then they split apart. Him heading for the corral where the horses were already panicking, eyes rolling white with fear. Her running toward the chicken coop where terrified birds squawked and fluttered against the wire. Daniel wrestled 3 spooked horses into the barn, their hooves striking sparks from the hard-packed earth, their bodies trembling with terror. He could hear Emma somewhere in the darkness calling to the chickens in a voice that somehow stayed calm, despite the wind trying to tear the words from her mouth. The girl had spine, he had to give her that. Rain came in sheets now cold and brutal, turning the yard into a river of mud. By the time they'd secured the barn and the coop, both of them were soaked to the bone and shaking. But there was no time to rest. The cattle were still out there, and Daniel knew from experience that terrified animals did stupid things. Ran into fences, trampled each other, or worse, scattered so far across the prairie they'd never be found again. He saddled 2 horses with numb fingers while Emma found rope and an extra coat that had belonged to Grace. It swallowed her small frame, but it was better than the thin shawl she'd been wearing. They mounted up, and Daniel led the way into the storm toward the north pasture where he'd last seen the herd. Lightning illuminated the landscape in violent bursts, fence posts leaning at drunken angles, tumbleweeds cartwheeling across the prairie, and in the distance, the dark mass of cattle bunched together and starting to move, starting to run. Stay with me, Daniel shouted over the wind. Don't get separated. They pushed their horses into a gallop, racing to get ahead of the herd. Daniel's plan was simple. Turn the leaders, force them into a circle, keep them from scattering. But simple didn't mean easy. Not in this weather, not with visibility reduced to whatever the lightning revealed and animals too frightened to think straight. A cow broke from the herd, bellowing heavy with calf. She ran straight for a section of fence that the storm had already weakened. Emma saw it happen and didn't hesitate. She wheeled her horse and went after the cow rope already swinging above her head. Daniel's heart jumped into his throat as he watched her lean from the saddle, impossibly small against the storm, and loop the rope around the cow's neck. The animal fought, pulling hard enough that for a terrible moment Daniel thought Emma would be dragged from the saddle. But she wrapped the rope around the horn and used her horse's weight to slow the cow, turn it, bring it back toward the herd. Her face was set with concentration, rain streaming down her cheeks. And in that moment, watching this girl he barely knew fighting a storm with nothing but determination and skill, Daniel felt something shift in his chest. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was fighting, and she was damn good at it. Together they worked the herd, shouting and whistling, using their horses to push the cattle into a tight circle. It took another hour, maybe more. Time lost all meaning in the storm, but eventually the animals settled, bunched together for warmth and protection, no longer trying to run. Daniel rode the perimeter one more time, counting heads by lightning flash, and was relieved to find they hadn't lost any. He dismounted and moved among the cattle on foot, checking for injuries, signs of distress. Most were fine, just spooked. But 3 cows were in active labor, pushed into it early by the stress of the storm. He knelt beside the first one, running experienced, hands over her swollen belly, and felt the calf moving inside. She's close, he said to Emma. Stay with her, talk to her, keep her calm. What are you going to do? Fix that fence before the whole damn thing comes down. He left Emma with the laboring cow and rode hard back to the barn to grab tools and fresh wire. By the time he returned, two of the cows had delivered, one successfully on her own, the other with Emma's help. He found her kneeling in the mud beside a newborn calf slick with birth fluid, helping it find its feet while the mother lowed anxiously nearby. "Is it all right?" Daniel called. "Strong?" Emma called back, and there was something like triumph in her voice. "It's strong." The third cow was having trouble. Daniel could see it immediately. The calf was turned wrong, one leg back, and the mother was exhausting herself trying to push it out. He stripped off his coat and rolled up his sleeves, and Emma moved beside him without being asked, holding the cow's head, murmuring nonsense words of comfort while Daniel worked. It was brutal, necessary work. He had to reach inside, find the trapped leg, turn the calf, while the mother bellowed and strained. His hands were numb from cold and slick with blood and birthing fluid. In the darkness and the rain, with lightning flashing overhead and thunder rolling like artillery, it felt almost like the war, like field surgery performed in desperate conditions with inadequate supplies and too many dying men. But finally, he felt the calf shift into position. "One more contraction," he said, his voice rough from shouting. "One more." The calf slid free, landing in the mud in a tangle of spindly legs and confusion. For a terrible moment, it didn't move. Daniel's hands froze, his breath caught in his throat. He'd seen too much death in his life. Too many things that should have lived, but didn't. Then Emma was there, clearing the calf's nose and mouth, rubbing it roughly with handfuls of prairie grass. The calf gave a wet cough and drew its first shaking breath. "Live," Emma said, and Daniel heard tears in her voice. "It's alive." They sat back in the mud, exhausted, while the mother cleaned her new baby, and the storm gradually began to lose its fury. The wind dropped from a scream to a moan. The rain became a steady drumming instead of a deluge. Dawn was breaking somewhere beyond the clouds, turning the world from black to gray. Daniel looked at Emma, covered in mud and blood and rain, shaking with cold and exhaustion, and felt something crack open in his chest. She'd stayed. She'd fought beside him. She'd saved that calf's life with nothing but determination and quick thinking. And she'd done it all without complaint, without hesitation, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "You did good," he said, his voice rough. She looked at him, and despite everything, the cold, the exhaustion, the fear, she smiled. "So did you." They rode back to the ranch as the storm finally broke, sunlight piercing through the clouds in golden shafts that made the wet prairie glitter like it was covered in diamonds. The damage was extensive. Fences down, shingles torn from the barn roof, the garden partially flooded, but the animals were safe. The ranch had survived. And Daniel Fletcher, for the first time in 3 years, felt truly alive. 3 days after the storm, Emma asked if she could ride into town with Daniel. She needed thread needles, maybe some cheap muslin, to make something new. She'd been wearing the same 2 dresses for weeks, washing and mending them, until the fabric was nearly transparent in places. Daniel had given her wages, $4 now carefully saved in a tin under her cot. She wanted to spend them like a person who had a right to. Daniel hesitated. He'd seen the way Wade Morrison's men had looked at her existence, the implications they'd made. Taking Emma into redemption felt like striking a match near dry kindling. But when he looked at her face, at the quiet determination there, he couldn't bring himself to say no. "All right," he said, "but we go in, get what we need, and come straight back. No lingering." "I understand." They rode in silence, Emma perched on the wagon seat beside him, wearing her better dress and the boots he'd bought her. She'd braided her hair and pinned it up, and in the morning light she looked older than her years. Not a child anymore, but not quite a woman either. Something in between, suspended in that difficult space where the world hadn't yet decided what to make of her. Redemption appeared on the horizon like a broken promise. A scattering of buildings huddled together against the endless prairie wood, and hope weathered gray by wind and disappointment. The main street was wide enough to turn a wagon, lined with a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith shop, and the white steepled church that stood like a judgment at the far end of town. It was Sunday, which meant people. Families in their church clothes gathered in small clusters outside the general store. Women with their marketing baskets. Men smoking and talking politics. Daniel felt every eye turn as he pulled the wagon to a stop in front of Porter's Mercantile. "Stay close," he said quietly. Emma nodded, but her face had gone pale. They climbed down from the wagon, and Daniel held the door for her. The bell above jangled, and inside the store smelled of coffee leather and the particular mustiness of dry goods kept too long in the heat. Mrs. Porter stood behind the counter, a thin woman with iron gray hair and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. "Mr. Fletcher," she said, her voice carefully neutral. Then her eyes moved to Emma. "And this must be your guest." "Emma Mahays," Daniel said before Emma could speak. "She's working my ranch. Needs some sewing supplies." "I see." Mrs. Porter's gaze raked over Emma like she was evaluating livestock. "Well, thread's over by the fabric. Needles are in the case." Emma moved toward the indicated area, keeping her eyes down, and Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. He wanted to say something to defend her against the weight of that stare, but he knew it would only make things worse. The door opened again, and three women entered. Mrs. Abigail Blackwood and two others Daniel recognized but couldn't name. Their conversation died the moment they saw Emma. "Why, Mr. Fletcher?" Mrs. Blackwood said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "How unexpected to see you in town on a Sunday." "Ma'am," Daniel touched the brim of his hat. Mrs. Blackwood's eyes moved to Emma, who had gone very still by the fabric table. "And you must be the young woman everyone's been talking about." "Emma, is it?" "Yes, ma'am." Emma's voice was barely audible. "How fortunate that Mr. Fletcher took you in after your tragedy. Such Christian charity." The words were right, but the tone was wrong. Sharp edges hidden under syrup. "Though I must say it does seem unusual for a young girl to be living alone with a bachelor. People do wonder about propriety." Daniel stepped forward, putting himself between Mrs. Blackwood and Emma. "Emma's working for wages, same as any ranch hand. Nothing improper about it." "Oh, I'm certain there isn't." Mrs. Blackwood's smile was thin as paper. "Still, appearances matter, don't they? Perhaps it would be more suitable if the girl stayed with a proper family. I'm sure we could find someone willing to take her in, teach her Christian values and appropriate behavior." "She's fine where she is," Daniel said flatly. "But is she, though?" One of the other women spoke up, emboldened by Mrs. Blackwood's presence. "A girl her age living with a man, no chaperone, no supervision. What kind of lesson does that teach? What kind of future does she have living like that?" Emma's hands trembled as she set down the thread she'd been holding. "I should wait outside," she said quietly. "No." Daniel's voice was sharp enough that several people turned to look. "You're a paying customer. You've got as much right to be here as anyone." "Mr. Fletcher," Mrs. Blackwood said, her voice hardening beneath the sweetness, "we're only thinking of the girl's welfare. Surely you can see how this situation looks." Daniel felt years of restraint cracking like old leather. 3 years of grief, 3 years of silence, 3 years of letting the world happen around him while he barely existed within it. But this judgment of an innocent girl who'd done nothing wrong except lose her parents and try to survive this, he wouldn't tolerate. "I don't care how it looks," he said, and his voice carried the weight of every battlefield he'd walked, every man he'd buried, every moment of suffering he'd endured. "Emma was orphaned. She needed help. I gave it. What I do on my own land with my own money is nobody's business but mine. It becomes our business when it affects the moral character of our community." Mrs. Blackwood snapped, the pretense of sweetness finally dropping. "That girl is living in sin whether you acknowledge it or not, and we have a responsibility. The only thing living in sin around here is your gossip." Daniel's voice was low but carried through the store like thunder. "Emma Hayes works harder in a day than most folks in this town work in a week. She's respectful, honest, and decent. Whatever poison you're spreading about her says more about you than it does about her." The store had gone silent. Even Mrs. Porter had stopped pretending to organize her inventory. Mrs. Blackwood's face flushed red, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. "How dare you?" she finally managed. "I am a deaconess of this church, a pillar of this community." "Then act like it," Daniel said. "Show some actual Christian charity instead of using it as an excuse to tear down a girl who's already lost everything." He turned to Emma, who stood frozen by the fabric table, her face white. "Get what you need. We're leaving." Emma's hands shook as she gathered the thread and needles, fumbling with her small purse to count out coins. Mrs. Porter took the money in silence, not meeting her eyes. The other customers had backed away, creating a circle of empty space around them like they were contagious. Outside, the bright sunshine felt like an assault. Daniel helped Emma into the wagon, aware of faces watching from windows, from the church steps, from every corner of the town. He climbed up beside her, took the reins, and guided the horses into a turn. They were halfway down the street when Emma spoke. "You shouldn't have done that. Someone needed to. They'll make your life miserable now." Daniel kept his eyes forward. "Let them treat me." But as they rode out of Redemption, leaving the white church steeple behind them, he felt the weight of what he'd just done settling onto his shoulders. In a town like this, crossing Mrs. Blackwood wasn't just social suicide. It was economic. She had the ear of every merchant, every rancher, every person who mattered. If she decided to make things difficult, she could turn Redemption against him completely. Beside him, Emma sat in silence, clutching her small package of thread and needles like they might anchor her to something solid. Tears tracked down her cheeks, but she made no sound. Just wept quietly while the prairie rolled past and the sun climbed higher in a merciless sky. The consequences came faster than Daniel expected. Within a week, merchants started raising prices when he came to shop. A bag of flour that had cost 5 cents last month now cost 10. Coffee went from 15 cents to 25. When Daniel questioned it, the answer was always the same, delivered with false sympathy. "Costs have gone up, Mr. Fletcher. Nothing personal." Supply orders he'd placed were suddenly delayed. "Wire fence for repairs. Haven't got it in stock yet. Nails, shipments running late. Hay for winter feed. Wagon broke down, try again next month." The blacksmith, a man Daniel had known for 5 years, suddenly claimed he was too busy to repair the plow blade that had cracked during spring planting. "Got a lot of work backed up, Fletcher. Maybe in a few weeks." But when Daniel rode past the shop later that day, the forge stood cold and empty. It was slow strangulation designed to break a man's will without leaving obvious fingerprints. But Daniel had survived worse. He'd lived through the wilderness campaign on hardtack and creek water. He'd spent a winter at Petersburg eating bark and boiling leather to make soup. He could handle expensive coffee and delayed supplies. What he couldn't handle, what made rage burn in his chest like artillery fire, was losing 5 head of cattle to what could only be theft. He found the gap in his fence on a Tuesday morning, fresh tracks leading east toward Morrison's land. No signs of wolves or predators, just boot prints and hoof marks and the unmistakable evidence that someone had cut his fence and driven his cattle through. He rode straight to town and found Sheriff Tom Bradley in his office boots up on his desk reading yesterday's newspaper. "Dan," Tom said, lowering the paper. His eyes held something that looked like guilt. "What brings you in?" "Lost 5 head of cattle last night. Fence was cut. Tracks lead toward Morrison's spread." Tom's feet came off the desk. "You sure about that?" "I can read," signed Tom. "Someone cut my fence and drove my cattle east. That's Morrison's land. That's not proof Morrison took them. It's enough to investigate." Tom stood moving to the window, looking out at Main Street like it held answers. "With folks in town right now. I know Mrs. Blackwood's been talking. But accusing Wade Morrison of cattle rustling, that's serious. I need real evidence." "I just gave you evidence. Tracks, cut fence, missing cattle. I need more than that. I need witnesses. Or better yet, I need to see Morrison's cattle with your brand on them." Daniel felt something cold settle in his stomach. "You're not going to do anything." "I didn't say that. I'm saying I need to be careful. Morrison's got influence. If I go accusing him without solid proof, it'll blow back on both of us. So my cattle are just gone. That's acceptable to you." Tom turned from the window, and Daniel saw frustration in his old friend's face. "It's not acceptable, but it's reality. We live in a place where power matters more than justice sometimes. You know that as well as I do. I know that in the war we fought for what was right even when it was hard. I know that you saved my life at Gettysburg because it was the right thing to do, not because it was easy. When did you stop caring about right and wrong?" The words hung between them like gun smoke. Tom's face went red, then white. "That's not fair, Dan. You know that's not fair." "Don't I?" Daniel moved toward the door. "I thought I knew you, Tom. Thought you were the kind of man who stood up for what was right regardless of consequences. Guess I was wrong." He left before Tom could respond, walking out into the afternoon heat with his hands shaking and his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. He'd lost more than cattle that day. He'd lost faith in a friend, in a man he'd trusted with his life. But that night something unexpected happened. As the sun was setting, Daniel heard a wagon approaching the ranch. He grabbed his rifle out of habit, still wary after the confrontation in town, and stepped onto the porch. It was Mrs. Peterson, a widow with 3 children who lived on a hardscrabble farm 5 miles south. Her youngest boy sat beside her on the wagon seat, his face covered in red welts. "Mr. Fletcher," she called, her voice tight with worry. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I heard Miss Hayes knows something about healing. My boy's got a rash, and it's getting worse. Can't afford Dr. Cole, and I didn't know where else to turn." Emma appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. She took one look at the boy and moved forward without hesitation. "Bring him inside," she said. "Let me take a look." Daniel watched as Emma examined the child with gentle, competent hands, asking questions about when it started, what he'd eaten, where he'd been playing. The boy whimpered but didn't cry, trusting this stranger with his pain. "It's not serious," Emma said finally, relief clear in her voice. "Looks like poison oak. Keep it clean, don't let him scratch, and it should clear up in a week or so. I'll make you a poultice to help with the itching." She disappeared into the kitchen and came back with a jar of something that looked like mud, but smelled like mint and willow bark. "Apply this twice a day, and if it gets worse or he develops a fever, you come back immediately. Or better yet, take him to Dr. R. Cole." Mrs. Peterson clutched the jar like it was gold. "I can't pay much, but I brought eggs." "That's more than enough," Emma said, smiling. After they left, Emma returned to the kitchen to clean up. Daniel followed, leaning against the doorframe, watching her work. "You're good at that," he said. "My mother taught me. She knew herbs, healing plants. Said knowledge like that was worth more than gold, because you could never lose it." She was right. Emma looked at him, then really looked at him, and Daniel saw something shift in her expression. Understanding, maybe, or recognition. "Mrs. Peterson came here because the town won't help her," Emma said quietly. "Because she's poor and alone and doesn't matter to people like Mrs. Blackwood." "I know. That's going to keep happening, isn't it? People coming here instead of going to the church for help." "Probably." Emma nodded slowly, and Daniel saw determination settle over her features like armor. "Good," she said. "Let them come." Over the next 2 weeks, more came. A ranch hand with a deep cut on his arm that Emma cleaned and stitched while Daniel held the man steady. An old Chinese man who worked on the railroad needing medicine for a cough that wouldn't quit. A young mother whose baby wouldn't nurse properly, terrified she was doing something wrong. Emma helped them all. Never charging money but accepting what they could give. Fresh meat, preserved vegetables, help with fence repairs, a slow economy of gratitude that operated completely outside Mrs. Blackwood's influence. And Daniel, watching this transformation, realized something profound. Emma Hayes wasn't someone who needed saving. She was someone who saved others. And in helping her, he hadn't rescued a victim. He'd given a healer the space to heal. But their fragile peace shattered on a Saturday afternoon when Maggie Warren drove her wagon into the yard like the devil himself was chasing her. Daniel was in the barn repairing tack when he heard the frantic sound of hooves and wheels. He grabbed his rifle and stepped outside, squinting against the afternoon sun. Maggie Warren was a widow, 28 years old, trying to keep a small farm running with just herself and her 10-year-old son. Daniel knew her by sight, had nodded to her in town a few times, but they'd never spoken more than pleasantries. Now she practically fell from the wagon seat, her face white with terror. "Mr. Fletcher," she gasped, "please, I need help. My son, he's sick, real sick. Dr. Cole's at Morrison's ranch, delivering a baby, won't be back for hours, and I don't know what to do." Daniel moved to the wagon and looked inside. The boy James lay on a pile of blankets, his face flushed with fever, his breathing shallow and rapid. Even without touching him, Daniel could see this was serious. Emma appeared at his elbow, drawn by the commotion. She took one look at James and climbed into the wagon without a word. "How long has he been like this?" she asked, placing her hand on the boy's forehead. "Since yesterday morning. Started as a stomach ache. Then the fever came. Mrs. Blackwood said it was probably just something he ate, that he'd be fine by morning, but he's getting worse." Emma's hands moved over the boy's abdomen, gentle but firm, and Daniel saw her face change. Saw fear flicker in her eyes before she masked it with professional calm. "Mrs. Warren," Emma said carefully, "I need you to help me get James inside. Mr. Fletcher, we need Dr. Cole, now." The urgency in her voice sent ice through Daniel's veins. He'd heard that tone before in field hospitals during the war. when surgeons knew they were racing death and losing. "What is it?" he asked. "Appendicitis, I think." His belly's rigid tender on the right side. "And the fever?" She looked at Daniel and he saw the question in her eyes. The doubt. The fear that she might be wrong. But he also saw determination. The same determination he'd seen in her face during the storm when she chased down that runaway cow. "You're sure?" he asked. "No, but if I'm right and we wait, he'll die." Daniel didn't hesitate. He ran for his horse, saddled it in record time, and rode out at a gallop toward Morrison's ranch. 10 miles of hard riding, pushing his horse to speeds that could break a leg if they hit a prairie dog hole. But James Warren was dying, and Dr. Cole was the only man within 50 miles who could save him. Behind him, Emma and Maggie carried the boy into the house, into Daniel's own bedroom, the only space clean and quiet enough for what might come. Emma worked with steady hands despite the fear coursing through her. Willow bark tea to fight the fever, cool compresses to bring down his temperature, careful monitoring of his breathing, his pulse, his pain. She remembered her mother's teachings, heard her voice as clearly as if she were standing in the room. Hard belly, one-sided pain, high fever. "That's appendicitis, Emma. If it ruptures, the poison spreads through the whole body. Most don't survive." Maggie sat beside her son, holding his hand, tears streaming silently down her face. "I should have come here first," she whispered, "when he started getting sick." But Mrs. Blackwood said she knew about these things, said I was being hysterical, that James just needed discipline, not coddling. So I listened to her. And now, "You're here now," Emma said firmly. "That's what matters." But inside she was terrified. What if she was wrong? What if it wasn't appendicitis but something else? What if Dr. Cole didn't come in time? What if James died here in this house because she'd convinced them it was serious when it wasn't? No. She pushed the doubts away. Her mother had taught her to trust her instincts, to listen to what the body was telling her. And James's body was screaming that something was very, very wrong. 2 hours passed. The longest 2 hours of Emma's life. James thrashed with fever, crying out in pain. Maggie prayed. Emma worked changing compresses, monitoring vitals, trying to keep the boy comfortable while they waited for help that might not come. Then she heard it. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses moving fast. Daniel burst through the door, followed by a gray-haired man carrying a black medical bag. Dr. Harrison Cole, 55 years old, with sharp eyes and capable hands. He took one look at James and his face went grim. "Appendicitis," he said. Not a question. A diagnosis. "Advanced. I need to operate immediately or he'll die." He turned to Emma, really seeing her for the first time. "You've been caring for him?" "Yes, sir." "Good work. The fever's high but manageable. He's hydrated. You might have saved his life by keeping him stable." Dr. Cole started unpacking his bag, setting out instruments with practiced efficiency. "But I need help. I can't do the surgery alone. Fletcher, you willing?" Daniel's hands clenched at his sides. He'd seen field surgery during the war, had held men down while surgeons worked, had watched limbs sawed off and wounds cauterized with hot iron. The memories were vivid enough to make his stomach turn. But he nodded. "Tell me what to do." "Actually," Dr. Cole said, looking at Emma, "I need both of you. Miss Hayes, you'll manage the chloroform. Keep him under, but not too deep. Monitor his breathing. Fletcher, you assist me directly. Can you handle blood?" Daniel almost laughed. "I've handled worse." "Then let's begin." They transformed Daniel's bedroom into an operating theater, boiling instruments on the stove, laying out clean sheets, Emma preparing the chloroform with hands that shook slightly but moved with growing confidence. Dr. Cole worked fast, explaining as he went. The first incision clean and precise. The blood that welled up, darker than Daniel remembered from the war. The careful separation of tissue layer by layer until the infected appendix came into view. "There," Dr. Cole muttered. "See, inflamed, swollen. Another few hours and it would have burst." Daniel saw the small, angry organ that could kill a child. Saw Dr. Cole's skilled hands removing that, tying off blood vessels, working with the calm efficiency of long practice. Emma counted drops of chloroform, watched James's breathing with hawk-like intensity. When his respiration slowed too much, she reduced the dose. When he started to stir, she added more, walking a tightrope between too much and too little, between safety and danger. And Daniel, holding retractors and passing instruments, felt a strange sense of purpose settle over him. This wasn't war. This wasn't killing. This was saving, creating life instead of ending it. And somehow being part of this, helping Dr. Cole and Emma fight for this boy's life, felt more meaningful than anything he'd done in years. The surgery took 2 hours. When Dr. Cole finally stepped back, washing blood from his hands, James was breathing steadily. Alive. Saved. Maggie collapsed into a chair, sobbing with relief. Dr. Cole looked at Emma with something like respect. "You have a gift for this young lady," he said. "Ever think about studying medicine properly?" Emma gave a tired laugh. "I'm an orphan with no money, Dr. Cole. Medical school isn't exactly an option." "Pity." He packed his instruments, his movements slowed by exhaustion. "But talent doesn't need a degree. You saved that boy's life today, Miss Hayes. Don't let anyone tell you different." After he left, after Maggie settled into a chair beside her sleeping son, Daniel found Emma on the porch staring out at the sunset. "You all right?" he asked. "I was so scared," she admitted. "What if I'd been wrong? What if it wasn't appendicitis? What if I'd made things worse?" "But you weren't wrong, and you didn't make things worse. You did exactly what needed doing when it needed doing. That takes courage." Emma turned to look at him, and in the fading light, Daniel saw something he hadn't seen before. Not a girl who needed protecting, but a woman who'd found her calling, someone who could stand beside him, not behind him. "Thank you," she said, "for believing me, for riding to get Dr. Cole, for helping during the surgery. I couldn't have done it without you." "We did it together," Daniel said, and meant it. The news spread through Redemption like wildfire. Within 3 days, half the town knew that Emma Hayes had diagnosed a dying child, that Dr. Cole had performed surgery at the Fletcher Ranch, that James Warren was alive because of them. And on Sunday, Maggie Warren stood up in church and told her story. Daniel wasn't there to see it, but he heard about it later from multiple sources, each telling essentially the same tale. Maggie had risen during the announcements, her voice shaking but clear, and spoken truth to power. She told them how she'd gone to Mrs. Blackwood first seeking advice about James's illness, how Mrs. Blackwood had dismissed her concerns, had called her hysterical, had said the boy just needed discipline, how she'd sent Maggie away without even looking at James. And then Maggie told them about coming to the Fletcher Ranch as a last resort, about Emma's immediate recognition of the danger, about Daniel's hard ride to fetch Dr. Cole, about the surgery that saved her son's life. "This is Christian charity," she'd said, her voice carrying through the packed church. "This is what love looks like. Not judgment, not gossip, but action. Helping when help is needed, not when it's convenient." The congregation had sat in stunned silence. Mrs. Blackwood, sitting in her usual pew near the front, had gone white as snow. Reverend Price had tried to smooth things over to suggest everyone had done their best with the information available. But the damage was done. The seed of doubt had been planted, and people started asking questions. If Mrs. Blackwood had been so wrong about James Warren, what else might she be wrong about? What other judgments had she made without real knowledge? What other lives had been affected by her certainty? That evening, Sheriff Tom Bradley rode out to the ranch. Daniel met him in the yard, wary but not hostile. "Dan," Tom said, dismounting, "got a minute?" "Always got time for an old friend." Tom flinched at the emphasis on friend. "I deserve that, and I deserve worse. I came to tell you I found your cattle, 5 head with your brand mixed in with Morrison's herd. I'm arresting him tomorrow for theft." Daniel felt surprise ripple through him. "What changed?" "Maggie Warren's testimony made me think about what you said, about right and wrong, about the kind of man I used to be." Tom met his eyes squarely. "I'm sorry, Dan. I let fear make me weak. I let Morrison and Mrs. Blackwood intimidate me into ignoring my duty. That ends now." Daniel studied his old friend's face and saw genuine remorse there, genuine determination. The man who'd saved his life at Gettysburg finally finding his courage again. "Takes guts to admit when you're wrong," Daniel said. "Thank you, Tom." They shook hands, and something that had been broken between them began slowly to mend. But the real shift in redemption came from an unexpected source. 2 days after Tom's visit, Reverend Price appeared at the ranch looking nervous but determined. "Mr. Fletcher, Miss Hayes," he said, twisting his hat in his hands, "I've come with a proposition from the church board. We'd like to offer Miss Hayes the use of the old schoolhouse to set up a clinic where she can help people who need medical care but can't afford Dr. Cole's fees." Emma's eyes went wide. A clinic for me. You've proven yourself, Miss Hayes. What you did for James Warren, that wasn't luck. That was skill and knowledge. The town needs someone like you. Dr. Cole has agreed to supervise you, teach you what he can when he's available. It won't be official medicine, but it'll be something, if you want it. Emma looked at Daniel, questions in her eyes. He nodded, smiling despite himself. There's one condition, Reverend Price added quickly. Mrs. Blackwood can't know I was involved in this decision. She's already, well, her position in the community has changed significantly. I don't want to make things harder for her. Daniel respected that. Kicking someone when they're down wasn't his style, even when they deserved it. We accept, Emma said, her voice strong and clear. And thank you, Reverend, for standing up for what's right. After he left, Daniel and Emma stood in the yard watching the sun set over the prairie. The future stretched out before them, uncertain but full of possibility. Things are changing, Emma said softly. Yes, Daniel agreed. They are. And for the first time in 3 years, Daniel Fletcher looked forward to tomorrow. The gifts started arriving the next morning. Not grand gestures or expensive items, but the kind of offerings that spoke louder than words ever could. A jar of honey from the Petersons, who'd lost 2 children to scarlet fever 5 years ago and understood the value of someone who knew healing. Fresh eggs from old widow Larson, delivered without comment, but with eyes that held gratitude for something Emma had done that Daniel didn't know about. A side of bacon from the railroad worker Mr. Chen wrapped carefully and left by the barn door. Daniel accepted each offering, storing them in the pantry, understanding what they really meant. These weren't just thanks for saving James Warren. They were statements, declarations of loyalty from people who'd been invisible to Redemption's respectable society, who'd been ignored by Mrs. Blackwood's charity because they didn't fit her definition of deserving. They were choosing sides, and they were choosing Emma. The economic pressure that had been strangling Daniel's business began to ease. Mrs. Porter's prices returned to normal, though her manner remained cool. The blacksmith suddenly found time to repair that plow blade. Supply orders started arriving on schedule again. It wasn't forgiveness, it was pragmatism. Half the town had turned against Mrs. Blackwood after Maggie Warren's testimony, and merchants couldn't afford to alienate customers in a territory where every dollar mattered. But the real change came from an unexpected direction. On Thursday afternoon, Wade Morrison appeared in Sheriff Tom Bradley's office, accompanied by his lawyer, and looking like a man who'd swallowed something bitter. Tom rode out to the ranch that evening to deliver the news personally. Morrison admitted to the cattle theft, Tom said, standing on Daniel's porch with his hat in his hands. Paid a fine, and he's returning your 5 head plus 2 more, as restitution. Said it was his men acting without his knowledge, but we both know that's horse manure. Daniel felt satisfaction, cold and sharp. What changed his mind? Morrison's not the type to admit defeat. His wife found out. Turned out she's friends with Maggie Warren, heard the whole story about James. When she learned what Morrison's men had done, trying to drive you out over the Emma situation, she gave him an ultimatum. Make it right or she'd leave him. And Morrison loves his wife more than he loves his pride. Huh. Daniel hadn't expected that. Good for Mrs. Morrison. And there's more. Tom shifted his weight, uncomfortable. Mrs. Blackwood, she's been removed from her position as head of the church auxiliary, voted out by the other women. Sarah Bartlett led the charge. Daniel remembered Sarah Bartlett, a quiet woman who'd lost her husband to a mining accident 3 years back. Never thought Sarah had that kind of steel in her. Neither did anyone else, but she stood up in front of the whole auxiliary and said she couldn't follow someone whose judgment had nearly killed a child. Half the women walked out with her. They're forming a new group, one focused on actual charity instead of social control. Tom looked out at the prairie at the sunset, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. You changed things here, Dan, you and Emma. Made people see that respectability isn't the same as righteousness. We just did what was right. That's more than most people do. Tom settled his hat back on his head. Anyway, thought you should know. Morrison won't trouble you again. And Mrs. Blackwood, well, she's got her own problems now. After Tom left, Daniel sat on the porch processing the news. He'd won. The town had chosen his side over Mrs. Blackwood's. Emma was safe. The ranch was secure. So why did he feel so uneasy? The answer came 2 days later when Mrs. Abigail Blackwood herself appeared at the ranch, driving her buggy alone, looking diminished somehow. Smaller. older. Daniel was mending fence when he saw her approaching. He set down his tools and walked to meet her, wary but not hostile. Emma emerged from the house wiping flour from her hands, and Daniel waved her back inside. Whatever Mrs. Blackwood had come to say, he'd handle it. "Mr. Fletcher," she said, not getting down from the buggy, "might I have a word? You're having one. In private, if possible." Daniel hesitated, then nodded. He led the way to the porch, far enough from the house that Emma wouldn't overhear, but close enough that he could call for help if needed. Not that he expected violence from this woman, but he'd learned in the war that desperate people did unpredictable things. Mrs. Blackwood climbed down from the buggy with stiff movements, and Daniel noticed for the first time how frail she looked. The armor of righteousness that had made her seem formidable was gone, leaving just a tired woman in a black dress. "I didn't come to argue," she said, settling into the porch chair without being invited. "Or to apologize, though I probably should. I came to tell you the truth. The truth I've been hiding for 20 years. Daniel leaned against the porch rail, arms crossed, waiting. "I had a daughter," Mrs. Blackwood said, her voice flat and distant. "Elizabeth. She died when she was 12 years old. It was 1865, near the end of the war. We were living in Kansas then, before we came to Wyoming." She paused, staring at her hands folded in her lap. Daniel said nothing, sensing this was a story that needed to come out in its own time. Elizabeth got sick, stomach pain, fever. The symptoms were similar to what James Warren had, though I didn't know the proper name for it then. There was a doctor in town, but I thought I knew better. I'd learned healing from my mother, you see. Herbs and poultices, home remedies that had worked for generations. Daniel felt something cold settle in his stomach. He could see where this was going. I treated her myself, refused to call the doctor because I was too proud, too certain that my mother's knowledge was sufficient. I prayed, I used every remedy I knew, and I watched my daughter die screaming in agony over the course of 3 days. Mrs. Blackwood's voice never wavered, but tears ran down her weathered cheeks. By the time I finally called the doctor, it was too late. He said if I'd brought her in and at the first sign of illness, he could have saved her. But I waited, because I thought I knew better. She looked up at Daniel then, and he saw devastation in her eyes. The kind of pain that never heals, just scabs over and breaks open again and again. When I saw Emma helping people, making diagnoses, acting like a healer without proper training, it terrified me. Because I did that. I thought folk knowledge was enough, and my daughter died because of my arrogance. "Emma's different," Daniel said quietly. "She knows her limits." She called for Nicole. "I know that now, but in the moment all I could see was myself. All I could think about was preventing another mother from losing a child the way I lost Elizabeth." "So you tried to control Emma, to stop her from helping people?" "Yes," Mrs. Blackwood's voice was bitter. "I told myself I was protecting people, but really I was punishing myself, trying to prevent others from making my mistake, even though their situation was nothing like mine." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun move lower on the horizon. He'd seen enough death in the war to understand guilt, to know how it could poison a person from the inside, turning them into something they never meant to be. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said finally. "Truly. But your guilt doesn't give you the right to control other people's lives." "I know." Mrs. Blackwood stood smoothing her skirts. "The church auxiliary voted me out yesterday. Most of my friends have stopped calling. My husband barely speaks to me anymore. I've lost everything I spent 20 years building. What will you do?" "I don't know. Leave redemption, probably. Start over somewhere else." She moved toward her buggy, then paused. "For what it's worth, Mr. Fletcher, I'm glad James Warren survived. I'm glad Emma was there to help him. I was wrong about her, about you, about everything." She climbed into the buggy and drove away, and Daniel watched her go with mixed feelings. He couldn't forgive her for what she'd tried to do to Emma, for the pain she'd caused, the trouble she'd made. But he could understand her, could see the broken mother beneath the self-righteous busybody. The war had taught him that people were complicated, that good people did terrible things, and terrible people sometimes had reasons that made sense from inside their own pain. It didn't excuse Mrs. Blackwood, but it explained her. Emma appeared beside him, moving silently as a ghost. "I heard," she said. "Some of it, anyway. She lost a daughter 20 years ago." That doesn't make it what she did right. No, but it makes it human. Daniel looked at Emma, at this girl who'd survived her own losses with such strength. You going to be all right? I think so. Emma leaned against the porch rail beside him. I feel sorry for her. Is that strange? No, it's compassionate. There's a difference. They stood in comfortable silence as the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in impossible colors. And Daniel realized something profound. Emma hadn't just brought life back to his ranch. She'd brought it back to him. Reminded him that the world was bigger than his grief, that there were still things worth fighting for, worth living for. 1 week later, Reverend Price returned to the ranch with formal papers. The church board had voted unanimously to let Emma use the old schoolhouse as a medical clinic. Dr. Cole had agreed to supervise her work, teach her what he could, provide guidance when cases got complicated. It's not a real medical practice, Reverend Price said apologetically. You won't be able to call yourself a doctor or treat serious injuries without Dr. Cole present. But for basic care, minor illnesses, preventive medicine, you'll have the church's full support. Emma held the papers with trembling hands. This is more than I ever dreamed possible. You've earned it, Miss Hayes. The whole town knows what you did for James Warren. Half of them are talking about bringing their children to you instead of riding all the way to Dr. Cole's office for every little thing. After Reverend Price left, Emma walked to the edge of the property and looked out across the prairie. Daniel followed, giving her space but staying close enough to be there if she needed him. I want both, she said suddenly. The ranch and the clinic. Is that selfish? It's a big bomb, but it means less time here, less time helping you with the work. Daniel considered that. The ranch did need 2 people to run properly. But Emma's healing skills were a gift that shouldn't be wasted tending chickens and pulling weeds. We'll figure it out, he said. Hire someone to help with the heavy work maybe. A ranch hand who needs room and board more than wages. Emma turned to look at him, and something in her expression made Daniel's breath catch. You do that, change how the ranch works just so I could have the clinic. Emma. He moved closer, drawn by something he couldn't name. You've already changed how everything works. The ranch, the town, me. What's one more change? Daniel. She said his name like a question, like a prayer. I need to tell you something. But before she could continue, they heard hoofbeats. Multiple riders moving fast. Daniel's hand went automatically to his hip where his pistol rested, and he stepped in front of Emma without thinking. 6 riders appeared over the ridge. Wade Morrison in the lead, followed by 3 ranch hands Daniel recognized. Behind them, Mrs. Blackwood in her buggy, driven by her husband. And bringing up the rear, Reverend Price, looking deeply uncomfortable. They formed a semicircle in the yard, and Daniel felt Emma press close to his back, her hand clutching his shirt. Morrison, Daniel said, his voice flat and hard. You're on my land again. Thought we settled this. We did. Morrison's face was grim. I'm not here to cause trouble, Fletcher. I'm here because Mrs. Blackwood asked me to come. Said she needed witnesses for something. Mrs. Blackwood climbed down from her buggy with her husband's help. She looked different than she had a week ago. Still worn, still diminished, but with a strange kind of peace in her eyes. Mr. Fletcher, Miss Hayes, she said formally, I've come to make a public statement, with witnesses present so there can be no doubt about what was said. Daniel's hand stayed on his pistol. What kind of statement? An apology and a retraction. Mrs. Blackwood took a deep breath. I have spent the past 6 months spreading lies and innuendo about Miss Hayes and about your character, Mr. Fletcher. I accused you of impropriety, questioned Miss Hayes's morals, and used my position in the church to turn this community against you. I did this not because I had evidence of wrongdoing, but because my own guilt and grief made me see danger where none existed. She paused, looking at Emma directly. Miss Hayes, you saved James Warren's life. You have helped dozens of people in this community with skill and compassion, and I repaid your kindness by trying to destroy your reputation. For that, I am truly sorry. Emma stepped out from behind Daniel, her chin raised. Why now? Why here with all these people watching? Because a private apology means nothing. I damaged you publicly. I should make amends the same way. Mrs. Blackwood gestured to Morrison, to Reverend Price, to her husband. These people will spread the word that I was wrong, that you and Mr. Fletcher have done nothing improper. that any talk suggesting otherwise is false. Morrison cleared his throat. For what it's worth, Fletcher, I'm sorry too. My men shouldn't have stolen your cattle. I shouldn't have let Mrs. Blackwood's talk influence me into thinking you were doing something wrong. You're a good man. Always have been. Daniel felt something loosen in his chest. Not forgiveness, not quite, but understanding. These people weren't, they were just flawed like everyone else. Like him. Apology accepted, he said. Now get off my land before I change my mind. Morrison actually smiled at that and tipped his hat. Fair enough. Come on, boys. They rode out, leaving just Mrs. Blackwood and her buggy. She climbed back in, but before leaving, she looked at Emma one more time. You have a gift, Miss Hayes. Don't let anyone, including me, make you doubt that. Use it well. Then she was gone, and Daniel and Emma stood alone in the yard as dust settled around them. That was unexpected, Emma said. People surprise you sometimes. Do they? Emma turned to face him fully. Daniel, we were interrupted before. I was trying to tell you something. I remember. She took a deep breath, and Daniel saw determination settle over her features. The same determination he'd seen in the storm and the surgery, in every moment where she'd refused to back down or give up. I love you, she said simply. I don't know when it happened. Maybe during the storm, or during James's surgery, or maybe in all the small moments between. But it's true, and I know you might not feel the same way. I know I'm just a girl you took in, that you're still grieving, Grace, that this might be the last thing you want to hear. Daniel's heart was hammering in his chest, but Emma kept talking, the words spilling out like she'd been holding them too long. But I needed you to know, because in a few days I'm going to start working at the clinic. I'll be spending time in town away from the ranch, away from you, and I can't do that without being honest about what I feel, what I want. Emma, Daniel found his voice finally. What do you want? You, she said so quietly he almost missed it. I want you, not as my employer or my protector, but as my partner, my equal, my husband if you'd have me. The world seemed to stop. Daniel stared at this girl, this woman who'd walked into his life like a ghost and brought him back from the dead, who'd reminded him what it meant to have purpose, to fight for something worth fighting for. You're proposing, he said, half laughing from shock. I am. Emma's chin lifted. My mother always said women didn't have to wait for men to do everything. So yes, Daniel Fletcher, I'm asking, will you marry me? Daniel felt something crack open inside his chest, something that had been frozen for 3 years, sealed away with Grace's death. Not grief exactly, but the ability to hope, to believe that life could hold joy again, that tomorrow might be better than today. Emma, I'm 23 years older than you. I'm a widower with ghosts that wake me up screaming some nights. I've killed men, good men. I've got debts and a struggling ranch and a reputation that's only just starting to recover. I know all that, and you still want to marry me. I don't want to marry you despite those things, Daniel. I want to marry you because of who you are, in spite of them. You survived a war and kept your humanity. You lost your wife and still found room in your heart to help a stranger. You're the strongest man I have ever known. And yes, I want to marry you. Daniel looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the truth written in every line of her face. This wasn't gratitude or dependency. This was love. Real clear-eyed, chosen love. I was going to ask you myself, he admitted, had a whole speech planned about how you'd brought me back to life, how you'd reminded me what it meant to have something worth protecting. But you beat me to it. Emma's eyes went wide. You were tonight, actually, after supper. I had this whole thing worked out. He laughed, and it felt good. Felt like shedding weight he'd been carrying too long. But your way's better, more honest. Is that a yes? Daniel pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her, and felt her heart beating against his chest. Yes, 1,000 times yes. The kiss was gentle, careful, a promise more than a passion. And when they pulled apart, both of them were crying tears of relief and joy, mixing together under the Wyoming sky. We'll need to do this right, Daniel said. Talk to Reverend Price, have a proper wedding. Small, Emma said. Just people who matter. Agreed. Daniel tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Emma, I can't promise you an easy life. The ranch is hard work. The town might still talk. And I'm not Grace. I can't be the same kind of husband I was before. I don't want you to be, Emma said firmly. I'm not Grace either. We're starting something new, our own story, and that's exactly what I want. They stood on the porch as the sun set, holding each other, and Daniel felt peace settle over him for the first time since the war. Not the peace of silence and solitude, but the peace of partnership, of knowing you weren't alone anymore, of having someone worth living for. The wedding took place on a cold November morning when the first snow had started to dust the prairie with white. They held it at the ranch with Reverend Price officiating and a small gathering of people who actually mattered. Sheriff Tom stood as Daniel's witness, looking proud and a little misty-eyed. Maggie Warren stood for Emma with James beside her, healthy and whole. Dutter Cole attended bringing medical texts as a wedding gift. Old Widow Larson brought enough food to feed an army. Even Morrison and his wife came bearing a fine wool blanket as peace offering. Mrs. Blackwood didn't come. Daniel hadn't invited her, and honestly, he was relieved. Some wounds needed time to scar over before they could be poked. Emma wore a dress she'd sewn herself from the blue fabric Daniel had bought her months ago. Simple but beautiful. Daniel wore his best shirt, the one Emma had mended so carefully that you couldn't see the repairs unless you knew where to look. Reverend Price spoke about new beginnings and second chances, about how God worked in mysterious ways, bringing people together when they needed each other most. It was standard wedding talk, but standing there holding Emma's hands, Daniel felt every word in his bones. Daniel Fletcher, Reverend Price said, do you take Emma Hayes to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do, and he meant it with everything he had. Emma Hayes, do you take Daniel Fletcher to be your lawfully wedded husband? I do. Emma's voice was clear and strong, and her eyes never left Daniel's face. Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Daniel, you may kiss your bride. The kiss was deeper than their first one, full of promise and hope, and the strange, terrifying joy of starting over. The small crowd cheered. Tom clapped Daniel on the back hard enough to hurt. Maggie hugged Emma and cried happy tears. And for a few hours they celebrated, ate Widow Larson's food, drank the whiskey Tom had brought, listened to Dr. Cole tell stories about medical school that made everyone laugh, watched James Warren run around the yard with boundless energy, living proof that sometimes against all odds, things worked out. As the sun began to set, the guests departed, leaving Daniel and Emma high alone in the house that was now truly theirs. Not his house where she worked, but their home. That night, lying in bed with Emma asleep beside him, Daniel thought about the journey that had brought him here. The war, Grace's death, 3 years of grief and isolation. The girl in the root cellar who changed everything. He thought about legacy, about what a man leaves behind when he's gone. It wasn't the ranch, he realized. Wasn't the land or the cattle or even the house. Legacy was the lives you touched, the people you helped, the world you left a little better than you found it. Emma had shown him that, had reminded him that survival wasn't enough, that living meant fighting for something bigger than yourself. And maybe that was the point. Maybe that's what Grace's death had been preparing him for. Not to replace her, but to be ready when someone else needed him. To be strong enough to stand up for what was right, even when the whole town stood against him. He pulled Emma closer, feeling her warmth, and finally let himself hope for the future. 6 months passed. Spring came to Wyoming, bringing green grass and newborn calves and the promise of another year. The clinic opened on a Tuesday in March. Emma worked there 3 days a week, seeing patients who couldn't afford Dr. Cole's fees or who just wanted the gentler touch of someone who listened more than lectured. She treated rashes and set broken fingers and delivered babies when Dr. Cole was too far away to come in time. The ranch adjusted. Daniel hired a young man named Peter, fresh off the immigrant boat from Germany, who worked for room and board while learning English. The garden expanded to the south field, providing vegetables they sold in town for extra income. The cattle herd grew, slowly recovering from Morrison's theft in the hard winter. It wasn't prosperity, it was sustainability. A life built on hard work and careful planning and the understanding that some days you scrape by and that was enough. Daniel and Emma fell into rhythms. Morning coffee before dawn, planning the day's work. Evenings on the porch talking about patience and cattle and small-town politics. Nights where they held each other and sometimes made love and sometimes just slept exhausted from the work of living. Some things stayed hard. Money was always tight. The clinic brought in more goodwill than Chaya since most patients paid in eggs or labor. A few people in town still whispered about the age difference, about impropriety, though the whispers had lost their venom. Mrs. Blackwood stayed in redemption, living quietly on the edge of town. Daniel saw her sometimes in the general store, and they nodded to each other with careful respect. Not friendship, but not enmity either. Just acknowledgement of shared history and mutual understanding. The nightmares still came. Some nights Daniel woke screaming, trapped in memories of Gettysburg or the wilderness. Emma learned to hold him through it, to speak softly until he remembered where he was, who he was, that the war was over and he'd survived. And slowly, very slowly, the nightmares came less often. On a warm evening in early May, 6 months to the day after their wedding, Daniel and Emma sat on the porch watching the sun paint the prairie gold. Emma had her medical journal open, recording notes about a difficult birth she'd attended that morning. Daniel was mending harness, his hands moving with the automatic precision of long practice. "Mrs. Chen's baby stopped breathing today," Emma said without looking up. "Just for a moment, I thought I'd lost him." "But you didn't." "No, Dr. Cole taught me a technique, clearing the airway, stimulating breathing. It worked. The baby's fine." She set down her pen. "But I was so scared, Daniel. What if next time it doesn't work? Then you'll have done everything you could. That's all anyone can ask." Emma closed the journal and moved to sit beside him. "How did you do it in the war? How did you keep going when people died despite your best efforts?" Daniel thought about that, about the men he'd tried to save and lost, about Grace dying while he held her hand and prayed to a God who didn't seem to be listening. "You remember them," he said finally. "You carry them with you, and you use what they taught you to save the next person. That's how you honor the dead, by fighting harder for the living." Emma leaned against his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence as stars began to emerge. A coyote called in the distance, lonely and wild. The wind carried the scent of sage and growing things. "What are you thinking about?" Emma asked. "Legacy," Daniel said, "about what we leave behind." "And what do we leave?" "Not buildings or land or money. Those things fade." He set aside the harness and wrapped his arm around her. "We leave the people we help, the lives we change. James Warren gets to grow up because you saved him. That's legacy. He'll have children someday, grandchildren, all because you knew what to do when it mattered. What about you? What's your legacy?" Daniel considered that. "I survived a war when good men didn't. I lost my wife but kept going. I found you in my root cellar and chose to help instead of turning away. And now we're here building something that matters. That's legacy enough for any man." Emma was quiet for a long moment. Then she said very softly, "I'm pregnant." Time stopped. Daniel's hand froze on her shoulder. His breath caught in his throat. "What? I'm pregnant. About 2 months along, I think. I wanted to be sure before I told you." Daniel felt emotions crash through him like artillery fire. Joy and terror and hope and fear all tangled together. A child, another chance at fatherhood, another life to protect, to love, to possibly lose. "Daniel." Emma pulled back to look at his face. "Say something, please." "I'm terrified," he admitted. "Grace and we never had children. I always wondered if it was my fault, if the war had broken something in me. And now the thought of you going through childbirth, of something happening to you. Dr. Cole will be there. I'll be there. Women have babies every day, Daniel." "I know, but knowing doesn't help." He pulled her close again, holding her like she might disappear. "I can't lose you, Emma. I barely survived losing Grace. If I lost you too." "You won't," Emma's voice was firm. "I'm young and healthy, and I know more about childbirth than most women. And I'm not going anywhere. You're stuck with me, Daniel Fletcher." He laughed, though it sounded more like a song. "Promise me something." "What?" "Promise me you'll fight, no matter what happens, no matter how hard it gets. Promise me you'll fight to stay with me." "I promise." Emma took his face in her hands, making him look at her. "I promise I'll fight. And you promise me something too. Promise me you won't let fear steal your joy. This baby, our baby, that's something worth celebrating." Daniel thought about all the things he'd lost, all the death he'd seen, all the pain that had shaped him into the man he was. And then he thought about Emma, about second chances, about how life kept offering opportunities to choose hope over despair, Love over isolation, future over past. I promise, he said. I promise to try me. They sat on the porch until full dark, holding each other, talking about names and cribs and all the ways their life was about to change. And Daniel Fletcher, veteran of a terrible war, widower rancher, felt something he'd thought lost forever. Absolute, terrifying, wonderful hope. The prairie stretched out in all directions, vast and unforgiving. But inside the circle of lamplight spilling from their house, there was warmth, partnership, love strong enough to weather whatever storms came next. Daniel had spent 3 years dead inside, just going through the motions of living. But Emma had brought him back. Not by replacing Grace, but by giving him new purpose, new reasons to fight. And their child growing inside her was the ultimate legacy. Not buildings or money or land, but life itself, continuing, growing, reaching toward the future with small, stubborn hands. "What are you thinking now?" Emma asked, reading his face in the lamplight. "That I'm the luckiest man alive," Daniel said. "That I don't deserve you or the second chance, but I'm grateful for both." "You deserve everything good, Daniel. You've earned it through blood and pain, and choosing to keep going when stopping would have been easier. We've both earned it." "Yes," Emma agreed, "we have." The wind picked up, carrying the promise of rain. Tomorrow would bring work, the ranch, the clinic, the 100 small tasks that made up a life. But tonight they had this, each other, hope for the future, a legacy being built one day at a time. Daniel Fletcher had been a soldier, a husband, a widower, a survivor. And now, impossibly, he was becoming something he'd never expected to be again, a father. The thought terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. But sitting there with Emma, feeling her warmth, her strength, her absolute certainty that they would be all right, he let himself believe. They would be all right. They would build this life together one day at a time. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal. The prairie slept under their light, waiting for dawn. And in a small ranch house 5 miles from anywhere that mattered, two people who'd lost everything found something neither had been looking for. Home. Not a place, but a person. A partnership. A promise that no matter what came next, they wouldn't face it alone. Daniel pulled Emma to her feet, kissed her forehead, and led her inside. Tomorrow would come soon enough, bringing all its challenges and joys. But tonight they had each other. And in the end, that was all any soldier ever really fought for. Not glory or honor or country, but the people worth coming home to. Emma was worth every battle, worth every scar, worth every hard choice that had led him here. And as he closed the door against the night, shutting out the darkness, Daniel made one final promise to himself. He would be worthy of this gift, this second chance, this woman who'd chosen him despite everything, who'd seen his broken pieces and loved him anyway. He would be the man she deserved, the father their child needed, the partner who stood beside her through whatever came next. Not because it was easy, but because it was right. And Daniel Fletcher had learned through war and loss and the slow, painful process of healing that doing what was right mattered more than doing what was easy. It was the only legacy that truly mattered, the only one worth leaving behind.